What's going on, everybody? My name is Courtney McIntosh. This is the Black Dad Chronicles, powered by Spreaker Networks. Spreaker.com. And I am back. It's been a while. I tried to start the year off strong, doing 31 days of podcasting. That didn't quite work out. Due to some things I've been dealing with. I'll get into that at a later podcast. But I've been, just say for not just the beginning of 2017, but probably about the last 6 months, 7 months, 8 months or so, I've just kind of been in a funk in my life, in my career, creatively. It seems the only thing good going good in my life is like my family dynamics, my immediate family, my wife, my kids. That's great. Home life is great. But some other things, like I said, I'm not going to get into, on today's episode. Today's episode is all about directing my ire towards my favorite team, my favorite sports team, period, and that's the Detroit Pistons. But first, a recap. Now, the last episode, which was January 7th, I talked about switching your allegiances. And I talked about how if the Pistons don't find some way to improve, I was going to look to switch my allegiance to a team that was probably younger, more exciting, better management. And, I've started to do that. I've started following the Brooklyn Nets, who, granted, aren't going to make the playoffs this year. They're also, not necessarily going to improve via the draft next year because they still don't have their own pick. It belongs to Cleveland via the Isaiah Thomas trade with the Celtics that they made. So Brooklyn has a daunting task to improve their youth. Now, one of the ways Brooklyn has looked to solve that problem is by buying low on good young players who have fallen out of favor with their teams. They traded for D'Angelo Russell from the Lakers this past offseason, and he was playing really good until he got injured. Then Jahlil Okafor had been out of the rotation in Philadelphia, so they sold very low on Jahlil Okafor. And both of those guys, they were the number 2 and 3 picks in their respective drafts. Both good, solid young talents who are kind of hampered by things that they can't control. With Okafor, it's the fact that the back to the basket center is becoming sort of an antiquated thing in the NBA. But he's tried to adapt to that by he's shooting threes. The Nets have him standing in the corner shooting threes. And then D'Angelo Russell, the whole thing with the fallout from, the Nick Young, Iggy Azalea breakup was basically started because D'Angelo Russell Snapchatted a video of Nick Young talking to him about girls he had been cheating with, and posted it on the internet. So, people don't trust D'Angelo Russell. The Lakers didn't trust D'Angelo Russell, especially with the idea that they were going to draft Lonzo Ball. I said, hey, this guy's not a leader. Let's get him out of here. So, the Nets are young. They're exciting. I enjoy following the Nets. I have 2 NBA teams on the Bleacher Report app that I have selected as my team, and that's the Pistons and the Nets. So the Detroit Pistons did something last night. A lot of people were insinuating that the trade deadline, which is next Thursday the 8th, February 8th, was going to be quiet. And a lot of people weren't expecting much. Well, leave it to Stan Van Gundy to, turn the NBA world on his ear. So since Stan Van Gundy, he's in the middle of his fourth year of a 5-year contract as president and coach of the Detroit Pistons. His MO, because, it's looked at as Detroit not being a destination for NBA free agents to go. You know, for years we've had this idea that's been around. Oh, free agents won't come here, so unless we overpay, blah blah blah. And if you think about it, if you go back and look through the history, it's not necessarily true. Throughout the early 2000s, when the Pistons were a good team and they won their last championship, 2004, they were kind of, you know, capped out and they were good and they weren't looking to sign free agents. You know, you had Chauncey and Rip and young Tayshaun Prince and Ben Wallace. Those guys weren't looking to sign marquee free agents, you know, because they had a good, solid team that was winning. Fast forward, a lot of people disagreed with the move at the time, but I agree with it because it freed up cap space. Joe Dumars sending Chauncey Billups home to Denver for Allen Iverson's contract, and that's basically what he did, was trade him for Allen Iverson's contract. Gave him cap room that year. But the Pistons went out and got two of the best free agents, probably two of the top 5 free agents that were available that year, in Charlie Villanueva and Ben Gordon. Turns out they just couldn't play, and Joe Dumars overpaid them. You added Ben Gordon, you know, to a backcourt that already had Rip Hamilton, and you paid him a ton of money to come in and be Rip Hamilton's backup. Then Charlie Villanueva wasn't necessarily a really good player, but Joe Dumars gave him all that money anyway. And then, you know, it's just kind of so you can't necessarily say Detroit hasn't been a destination city because they haven't necessarily ever been in position to go after, cap-wise, to go after, you know, one of the prime marquee free agents, right? So what Stan Van Gundy has done in his tenure is he's looked for good young pieces on long-term deals and then traded for them. And that's been his way of, you know, dealing with free agency, or the free agency issue. I'm using air quotes. So last night I saw some rumblings. So I've given myself kind of like a social media hiatus. So I took, you know, all my social media apps off my phone. The only social media app I have on my phone is Google Plus, and I basically use Google Plus as an RSS aggregate to get news. But Bleacher Report popped up. You know, Avery Bradley. The Pistons made Avery Bradley available. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. We get some for Avery Bradley. You know, not having his worst year. His reputation has kind of somewhat been challenged, but possibly can get you something via trade. He has a cap friendly contract. He's a free agent after this year. Maybe a contending team would be willing to trade for Avery Bradley and give you something. Then, you know, news turns out that the Lakers offered Jordan Clarkson for Avery Bradley. I would have took that deal. Me being honest, because one of the things that the Pistons lack, the main thing that the Pistons lack, especially with Reggie Jackson being injured, is guys who can put the ball in the basket. They don't have any playmakers. Jordan Clarkson is a playmaker. Jordan Clarkson can put the ball in the basket, and he's young. So you would have thought he was like an ideal Stan Van Gundy draft, you know, trade target. But, you know, he decided not to. Okay, cool. Then it turns out Bleacher Report broke Pistons and Clippers in serious talks and Blake Griffin trade. I'm like, oh, hell no. I just knew it would be bad news. The basis of the trade would include Avery Bradley, Tobias Harris, who's in the middle of his best season. He's 25 years old. You still have him locked up for another year after this one. And I'm like, okay, just Avery and Tobias for Blake Griffin. I was like, okay. So I was skeptical. Then the news comes out. Tobias Harris, Avery Bradley, Boban Marjanovic, Blake Griffin coming back to the Pistons. I'm like, man, there's a but in this. This draft is looked at as it's not as top heavy as the year before last, but this draft is looked at as a quality draft. And one of the things that you can doubt. So, Stan Van Gundy, during his tenure as Pistons president and head coach, he's shown that he has a knack for fleecing teams via the trades. But his drafting has left, his draft and personnel moves have left a lot to be desired. Notable players who should be Pistons but aren't Pistons. Chris Middleton, thriving in Milwaukee. Spencer Dinwiddie, flourishing with playing time in Brooklyn, with the Nets that I mentioned earlier. Spencer Dinwiddie was Stan Van Gundy's first draft pick when he came to Detroit, because the Pistons did not have a draft pick that year because it went to Charlotte, and I forgot what in the Corey Maggette trade. That pick went to Charlotte in the Corey Maggette trade. So Spencer Dinwiddie was the number 37 pick in that. What year was that? Let me see. Spencer Dinwiddie draft year.
Spencer Dinwiddie's NBA draft year is 2014.
All right, in the 2014 draft. So let's go to the 2014 draft. Because we'll look and see who was available at that number 9 pick, because that's the pick that the Pistons ultimately got, and that's the pick that went to Charlotte. So who was that? Let me see. That was the Andrew Wiggins, Jabari Parker draft. So the number 9 pick was Noah Vonleh. Noah Vonleh was drafted by the Hornets, eventually traded to the Blazers. So here are some guys that were available at number 9 that had the Pistons not traded for Corey Maggette, they could have had. Let me see. Elfrid Payton, who they tried to trade for multiple times last year. Dario Saric, who's flourishing in Philadelphia, coming off the bench, but he's looked at as part of their, young core. Zach LaVine, we've seen Zach LaVine, offensively, beast. TJ Warren, who, it may be a case of, bad team, big stats guy, but he looks like he's the real deal in Phoenix, even though they're a terrible team. You got Gary Harris, Rodney Hood, Shabazz Napier, those are guys that, you could have Spencer Dinwiddie was the number 38 pick. But those were guys you could have had instead of Corey Maggette, and Corey Maggette didn't really do anything for the Pistons, So you give up the number 9 pick that year, right? So let's go to 2015. Detroit Pistons back in the playoffs. Back in the lottery. That's the Karl Anthony Towns draft. And one of the things about the Pistons was Joe Dumars never wanted to tear it all down and start from the bottom. Even though I believe that because he was so loved here, he would have been given that chance. And a lot of guys aren't given that chance to rebuild and then see the whole process through. I think that because of the cachet that Joe Dumars had in the city of Detroit and for the organization, he was with the organization his entire career. He would have been allowed to tear it down and then try to build it back up, but he chose to build on the fly. So it turns out that the Pistons were always stuck kind of in purgatory. Too much money. He gave too much money to bad players, and they always won too many games to, be even in the running for a top, draft pick. So the 2015 draft was the Karl Anthony Towns, D'Angelo Russell, Jahlil Okafor draft. Kristaps Porzingis also went number 4 to the Knicks that year. So you draft Stanley Johnson at number 8. ahead of guys like Miles Turner. Trey Lyles looks to be really good now that he's getting some playing time in Denver. Devin Booker, who possesses the one thing the Pistons have lacked since, Rip Hamilton, a reliable shot maker, was drafted 13. Kelly Oubre, who is having his best season in Washington. Terry Rozier, who is a key piece in Boston right now. Rondé Hollis-Jefferson, Bobby Portis. You could have had a bunch of those guys. You could have had one of all those guys, but you chose to draft Stanley Johnson. And listen, I wasn't high on Booker. I actually was, wanted the Pistons to draft Justice Winslow just because he was like, kind of a do-it-all guy at Duke for his 1 year. I was like, man, versatility, Kelly Oubre also, he was decent at Kansas, but he was a freshman and left after 1 year. So the bad drafting starts right there with Stanley Johnson. Then you jump to 2016. So the 2016 draft, the Pistons didn't have a high draft pick. They made the playoffs. So at number 18, they draft Henry Ellison from Marquette, right? So here's some guys they could have had instead of Henry Ellison, who doesn't even play. And it looks like he can't play at the NBA level. So here are some guys that you could have drafted at 18 instead of, Henry Ellison. Karis LeVert, who starts, he's been hurt, but he's a starter in Brooklyn. Looks to be a very, very reliable young player. You could have drafted DeAndre Bembry, who gets, playing time in Atlanta, but they're bad. Malachi Richardson in Syracuse, he doesn't play. Skal Labissiere in Sacramento, who I wanted them to draft because before that year, before his freshman season at Kentucky, Skal Labissiere was looked at to be in the running for the top pick that year. We all know the top picks was Ben Simmons, but before that college year started, Skal Labissiere was in the conversation for the number one pick in the NBA draft of that year. DeJounte Murray, who is now the starting point guard in San Antonio. Let's see, Tyler Ulis, who is starting point guard in Phoenix. Malcolm Brogdon, last year's Rookie of the Year in Milwaukee. Who else? Man, you could have, those are just a couple guys you could have had instead of a guy who's basically just a warm body for you to put in warm-ups. All right, 2017. Here's where it gets upsetting. Now, coming into that year, it was considered that the Pistons' biggest need was shooting. Because, Stan Van Gundy had this offense predicated on shooting, but didn't have any shooters. So, I was hoping Malik Monk would have failed, but he was drafted at number 11. Detroit had the number 12 pick in the draft. And they ended up drafting the safe pick, Luke Kennard, out of Duke, when they could have drafted. And then the fact that, you hear that Donovan Mitchell had such a great workout in Detroit. He said he didn't miss a shot in Detroit. He was confident that he was going to Detroit. He said he just knew that he was going to Detroit. And they drafted Luke Kennard and not Donovan Mitchell. And we see what Donovan Mitchell is doing as a rookie in Utah. Donovan Mitchell just may be the Rookie of the Year since Ben Simmons has tailed off, and so is Jason Tatum. Donovan Mitchell has shown that he's explosive, he can shoot, he can run an offense, he plays defense. He's a bucket getter. Not saying Luke Kennard is bad. Luke Kennard's not bad. He's shown that he can play in the NBA. He's just not exciting. He's just not sizzle, and he can't do as much as Donovan Mitchell. But, granted, Donovan Mitchell's given free reign in Utah. We don't know what Luke Kennard really can do because he's only had one game where he's played over 30 minutes and only 3 games where he's played over 25 minutes this season. That's going to change starting tonight because Avery Bradley's no longer on the team. So I think it's safe to assume that he's going to be the team's starting shooting guard from here on out. But here's some guys who are playing good that the Pistons could have drafted instead of, Luke Kennard. Donovan Mitchell. John Collins down in Atlanta who was really good. Terrence Ferguson. OG Anunoby. OG Anunoby was injured, had tore his ACL in January of last year at Indiana. He is what, the Pistons hoped Stanley Johnson could be. A 3-and-D player. He wasn't seen as that much of a shooter coming out of college, but he is shooting a respectable amount from 3, like maybe, 38%, something like that. And he's showing that, he can actually play and he's healthy. Kyle Kuzma. Yes. Kyle Kuzma, who was drafted number 27 by Brooklyn, who was, he was included in the trade to the Lakers for D'Angelo Russell. Jordan Bell, Semi Ojeleye, guys who can play, and those are just a couple guys they could have taken instead of Luke Kennard. So here's the thing, right? I'm not just like bashing Luke Kennard. I like Luke Kennard. He fit the draft pick. He fit what the Pistons needed. So yesterday, the Pistons go out and trade for Blake Griffin. So you trade Avery Bradley, Tobias Harris, Boban Marjanovic, a lightly protected first round draft pick. And I think the thing that sticks with me most, that irritates me the most about this trade is the fact that, it wasn't a lottery protected draft pick, meaning that if the Pistons didn't make the playoffs, if it would have been lottery protected, they still would have kept their pick. But you basically give away the farm for Blake Griffin. Blake Griffin, who's 29 years old, was making $30 million a season in the first year of a 5-year, $171 million deal, $173 million deal season. So you trade away your 2 starting wings for Blake Griffin, Bryce Johnson, and Willie Reed. Blake Griffin, and injured Blake Griffin, oft-injured Blake Griffin. Blake Griffin, who missed 99 games in the last 3 years, the last 4 years, I'm sorry, including 16 this season. Blake Griffin, who's not Blake Griffin, jumping over kids and winning the slam dunk contest and yamming all over Kendrick Perkins. You're not getting Lob City exciting Blake Griffin. Blake Griffin is still a good player. He's a really good player. But for a guy with his injury history and his contract, it's way too much. Way too much. That first round pick put it over the top. And a second round pick next year. And the protection of the pick is only 1 through 4. So the Pistons, say Reggie Jackson comes back. Doesn't come back healthy like last year. So an issue we had, not only to stand and rush Reggie Jackson back last year, Reggie Jackson had trouble acclimating to the rest of the team. Coming back from injury. Who's to say Reggie Jackson is not going to have that same issue trying to reacclimate himself to the team? And then you give up a first round pick and barely put any protection on the pick. That's probably what, if this was Blake Griffin 4 years ago, with healthy knees, I'd be, oh man. Blake Griffin last played over 67 games in the 2013-2014 season. He only played 80 that season. But if you're getting out of Blake Griffin, fine. Okay. And then one thing that's been bandied about on Pistons Twitter, which I haven't seen it discussed anywhere else but Pistons Twitter, is the training staff. The Pistons training staff has been. I don't know if you can blame the Pistons training staff for Reggie Jackson, coming back, rushing back so early last year, still not being healthy. I don't know if you frustrating as a Pistons fan, and it's like I just, man, oh boy. Right. So, I mean, I've had a chance to, unpack this. The Pistons are gambling, they're taking a really big gamble. And, Steve Gundy, I think I said the best on NBA TV last night. We're at this situation because of the inability, Steve Gundy's inability to identify talent and draft with. I'm not saying Steve Johnson's going to be a good player. Look, Steve Gundy probably hasn't helped with the fact that, Stanley Johnson hasn't developed because Stanley Johnson's always consistently in the doghouse. But the fact that, you were choosing between, you were split on Booker and Stanley Johnson up to, when you made the pick. So what you had KCP, still drafted the best offensive player. The league has been trending towards offense for a while now. If you draft Devin Booker, you wouldn't have to worry about offense. And the Pistons' offense in the Stan Van Gundy era has been terrible. They've been a good defensive team, but offensively they have been terrible. Devin Booker helps with that. Donovan Mitchell helps with that. Henry Ellis and Stanley Johnson don't help with that. Luka might help with that. But, last night, this was last night, I'll be on here ranting and raving, cussing and fussing, raising my blood pressure up. But the main reason why I'm sour on this trade is Blake Griffin's injury history and the fact that you barely had any concessions to that draft pick. I mean, the pick is likely as protected 1 through 4 this year, next year, and the year after. So 2018, 2019, 2020. So, knowing the Pistons, even if Reggie doesn't come back, because right now the Pistons are not filling Eastern Conference. They're 2.5 games behind Philly. But I also think that banking on Joel Embiid to not be healthy, as a reason to say that, the Pistons, have a shot at making AFC is foolish. We don't know if Embiid is going to get hurt this year. He hasn't been playing back-to-backs, but that's precautionary. And Joel Embiid has been damn good this season. Joel Embiid is probably the most improved player in the NBA this season. The Pistons, I get it. The Pistons had lost 8 straight games. Stan Van Gundy's desperate and fighting to save his job. Teams like this make desperate moves. But this was not a basketball move. This is strictly a move to put assets in the seats at the new arena, which, is an embarrassment. Every single night, every single time the Pistons are on national TV, you can see a sea of red and empty seats. That's what this move is. Their owner lives in LA. He probably like, oh yeah, Blake Griffin, did he jump over here a couple years ago? Yes, and how much money does he make? Oh, I don't care about that. He jumps over here. Yeah, we can trade for him. And then he released a statement last night. Tom Gores did. Tom Gores is the guy who probably doesn't even. I mean, from what I understand, from what has been reported, the Tom Gores has only been Tom Gores has only been in 3 games this season. Yeah. The Pistons have hamstrung themselves. Because listen, Blake Griffin's contract doesn't come up good until the 2021 season. In that year, which he has a player option for, he is scheduled to make $13 $39 million. And he'd be a fool if he didn't opt into that. Andre Drummond is signed through that season. Andre Drummond is signed through that season as well. In his last season, he'll be making $30 million. Reggie Jackson is still signed too. And here's the thing, right? The reason, a couple more reasons why I don't like this trade for the Pistons. You didn't get off John Lewis' contract. Yeah, he's hurt for the rest of the season. But I can understand, including a lightly contested first round pick. If you got off of John Lewis' contract or Reggie Jackson's contract, you didn't either. And you absorbed Blake Griffin's contract. And you took a guy who's been constantly injured over the last 4 years. And you still gave up a freaking first round pick and a pretty deep draft. We know Sam Van Gundy was going to tank. His job's on the line. He came in, from the beginning with a mindset that he was going to win now. It's like, damn, I wish Dan Gilbert on the Pistons instead of the Cavs. And I'm not a Dan Gilbert fan. I'm not a fan of Dan Gilbert. But he's from Detroit. He owns pretty much all of downtown. The Cavaliers, they got lucky and drafted LeBron James. But he's still allowed to tear it down and be bad. You say that he made bad moves by not resigning Blake Griffin and treating his GMs like crap. But he cares about basketball. He cares about winning. He's at the lottery. You know what I'm saying? The Cavaliers are at the lottery. His son was representing a team in the lottery. Dan Gilbert cares about basketball. He cares about a winning basketball team. The only thing Tom Gores is known for around here is opening night at LCA this year, throwing t-shirts into the stands with his chest hair showing. Other than that, he's an absentee owner. Like I said, I was going to get on here ranting, but I decided to switch my allegiance. And this move doesn't even, guarantee the Pistons make the playoffs this year. Because the most important guy on that team is still Reggie Jackson. And for all the guys that know Reggie Jackson sucks, you, Meech, I'm talking to you, and the rest of Pistons Twitter who think Ishmael should have been the starter over Reggie Jackson. Well, here's what you got. Ishmael is the starter because Reggie Jackson got hurt. It was a fluke injury, a turn ankle that turned out to be way more severe than we thought it would be. But if Smith should be the starter, he's better than Reggie Jackson. Yeah, well, they're 3-12, 3-13 since Reggie Jackson got hurt. The Pistons are 8-20 in their last 28 games. They were 14-6 on November 29th. And it's been downhill ever since then. And got one person to blame. That's Sam Van Gundy for being a poor evaluator of talent, having a poor draft record, and not developing his young players. I was scared when, the day after the draft, Sam Van Gundy, and Luke Kennard's press conference, talking about, before he's against on the court, he's got to learn how to play defense. Defense is not what matters in the NBA now. Scoring more points than other teams is. Just so happens Donovan Mitchell would have been able to help you on both ends of the floor. Devin Booker would have been able to help you on the most important game. Stanley Johnson can't hit the side of a barn. Plays defense pretty good. But he can't hit the side of the broad side of a barn. First game of the year, he was over 13. Still not shooting good. Yeah, his hip injury, maybe contributed to that, but it also could be the fact that he's a bad offensive basketball player. Devin Booker is a spectacular offensive basketball player. Devin Booker scored 71 points in a game. And yeah,
championship instead of Brandon Knight, a guy who, led his Kentucky team to the Elite Eight. We wouldn't even have to worry about trading for Kemba Walker because we have drafted Kemba Walker. But nope, Joe DeMar is short-sighted and go with this established guy to lead the league with a smart guy. And look, Brandon Knight's a smart guy. He chose between Harvard and Kentucky. He's not that good at basketball. And then he's been hurt over the last couple of years. Chris Middleton, flourishing in Milwaukee, could be the go-to offensive player that the Pistons could depend on in the clutch. Nope. He was feeling like something. I mean, especially we wouldn't have to worry about Reggie Jackson, not being able to score points, or our backup not being able to score points because especially then when he was Reggie Jackson's backup, probably wouldn't be 3-13 since Reggie's been out. Probably would have been better last year, even though Ishmael was adequate last year while Reggie Jackson was out. Probably would have been better last year. So I'm pissed. But you know what? So let's switch my allegiance. But that's it today. Not even gonna get me all out of trouble because I kind of work myself up. Not about the business. But I just don't see financially it doesn't make sense. Basketball wise, it doesn't make sense. This is just an attempt to get the casual fan to come down to the Pistons of the arena and not be embarrassed. So the team won't be embarrassed when they play national TV games and you see all those empty seats on TV. That's it. That's it. Blake Griffin's already missed 16 games this year. Hey, you not having missed any games this year? You're like, oh, look, man, Blake Griffin might be healthy. But for the guy whose athleticism, whose game was mostly tied to his athleticism, but he's great. Give it to Blake Griffin. He's changed his game. He's a special playmaker. But it makes the Pistons less versatile and the police team depth. Now we got to rely on guys who haven't proven to be reliable. Starting lanes, Reggie Bullock and Luke Kennard. Stanley Johnson still coming off the bench. It still doesn't solve